Hello, good afternoon. Hope you guys are enjoying Washington, D.C. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So it's my pleasure today to work with these distinguished lady and two gentlemen. We're going to present today on blockchain and government. So first thing we're going to do is we're just going to take an opportunity to introduce ourselves to you. My name is Joel Braithwaite. I am a partner at Cogent Law Group. We work with blockchain companies, helping in companies, startups in particular, and we hope that we do a great job with our clients on any number of problems that they come to us to solve. Today I'm joined by Darren Jones from the Greater Phoenix Economic Council. Darren, could you just give us a quick spiel about yourself?
Sure. I run the emerging technology practice at the Greater Phoenix Economic Council. We're a public-private partnership. We have about 170 private investors and then a couple of cities that invest in our organization. And our mandate really is to attract companies to the region to invest in our region. So cybersecurity, blockchain, sensor technology, wearables, AI, AR. I interface with a lot of those companies from the Fortune 100 level down to the small startups to assist them with their investment in the Phoenix and the Western United States.
Yeah, okay. And next we're joined by Chelsea Parker from the Blockchain Alliance in Steptoe.
Great, thanks. So the Blockchain Alliance is a nonprofit actually founded by industry in 2015 to educate law enforcement and government regulators on cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology and clear up some of the misconceptions surrounding criminal use of blockchains. And then I also work at Steptoe & Johnson, which is an international law firm with a blockchain and cryptocurrency practice.
Okay. And lastly, we're joined by Mr. Adam Healy.
Hi, Adam Healy. I'm the head of security at Digital Asset Custody Company. Just as our name suggests, we are an institutional quality third-party custodian for digital assets. We currently custody just over 90 digital assets for registered investment advisors, hedge funds, high net worth individuals that have a material position in this alternative asset class that we all call crypto.
So part of our first discussion point we wanted to bring to the audience today is a discussion of our barriers to adoption. So I present to the panel, can we talk about different barriers to adoption that you see for the United States government and probably even state and local governments?
I guess I can start, and then we can pivot down the row here. Education. So this year we passed in Arizona the first FinTech Sandbox. And this is designed to enable companies that are innovating in the financial technology space on consumer loans and blockchain and cryptocurrency and money transmitters to test and deploy their products in our state without complying with the Department of Financial Institutions, which is our regulatory body for licensure for those products. The two-year glide path in the program, so you have 2 years to test and deploy your product amongst 10,000 consumers in Arizona, and we're the only state in the country that has that legislation. So what we've seen now is companies coming from London, from Singapore, from Australia who have left the United States because we didn't have the requisite legislation to provide that certainty, coming back to our market to deploy their products here. But how we did that, and we have some other legislations that we passed over the last year, 2 years actually, that I'll speak to later, but the biggest kind of fundamental aspect of that was really educating our legislators. So we convened a group of industry experts in blockchain and cryptocurrency to brief our legislatures on everything related from money transmission, AML, KYC, to the fundamentals of blockchain protocols, and how that will enable development and investment and industry growth in our region. So when you speak the language of a legislature that says, what's in it for me, what's in it for my taxpayer, that's really what piques their interest. And when they see that, okay, this is going to create a sustainable, stable economy, we have a lot of pilot projects we can do in our region to make government more efficient. But as long as they understand those fundamentals and it's coming from the industry and industry engagement, that's really how you reduce those barriers to adoption.
Yeah, and I might just piggyback off that, because education at the Blockchain Alliance was created to educate law enforcement and government agencies. So that's something extremely important to us. And Adam and I were talking earlier about how do you stay up to date? How do you keep regulators and government agencies up to date on a technology that is changing all the time? And that's why our model, and it sounds like similar to the work you've done, we really bring industry in to educate them and to continue educating them as things change. So that, with any new technology, it's evolving all the time and they can stay up to date. And that's something the blockchain industry in particular has done really proactively, both through the Blockchain Alliance and other methods. And then in terms of the U.S. government, the GSA does a really good job through their Emerging Citizens Technology Program and bringing agencies together to talk through use cases, talk through misconceptions that might be hindering adoption, and kind of work together on that education aspect.
Yeah, and I would probably just add, coming from more of a New York investment perspective, barriers to entry for any nascent industry, whether that be blockchain or crypto that's backed by blockchain, a lot of it, for folks in my world, gets back to regulatory clarity. There's a lot of articles that have been out recently around there's 10 billion arguably of institutional capital on the sidelines. That's probably closer to 100 billion in reality. What's largely that barrier to entry at this point seems to be regulatory clarity and guidance from federal regulators, state level regulators, and then alignment across all of those. There's different opinions depending upon which state you're in, this policy versus that policy, or a lack of policy guidance from the federal level creates kind of a wild west of patchwork, much like we've seen in other emerging industries or in other emerging asset classes in not too distant pasts.
Okay, so let's talk about the regulatory sandbox. So I think that probably intrigues a lot of people. Can you explain a little bit more to us? Okay. Can you explain a little bit more to us about the legislation that it took to make that happen?
Sure. So one of the things that we noticed our mandate at Greater Phoenix Economic Council is to attract companies, high growth companies to the region. So how do we enable that through legislation? We saw that companies were leaving New York, companies were leaving California, companies were leaving other areas in the United States or in the fintech space and going to other markets where they deployed sandboxes. So there's a sandbox in London, there's a sandbox in Australia, there's a sandbox in Singapore, there's a sandbox in Taiwan, there's a sandbox in Eastern Europe. So what we did is we crafted a reciprocity agreement whereby a company that is participating in those sandboxes internationally can come back to our market and deploy their product in the U.S. So now these companies are a bit more mature, and they have an addressable market that they've identified in the U.S., and now they have that regulatory certainty, to Adam's point, that they will participate in our market and that they will not have to go through some of the burdensome and costly licensing requirements until they have a minimally viable product. Because typically if you're a startup and you're innovating in this space, that's one of the biggest barriers to entry is compliance and licensure. So you reduce that barrier for 2 years. You test and deploy, and you either figure out that, okay, we don't have an addressable market here, it's not viable in the US, or it is. And then once you start to really go to scale, that's when you start the compliance. Now you have revenue, you have a customer base. It's not as burdensome, and that barrier to entry is significantly reduced. So that was the ideation behind it. And then again, from our local representatives in Arizona, they wanted to continually enable the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry. So I'm not going to go too much into this because I don't want to jump too much ahead, but we passed the first smart contract legislation last year, which is an amendment to our Electronic Records Act that says that a smart contract is enforceable by law. We were the first state in the country to do that. We also, one of the second states in the U.S. to pass a crowdfunding exemption for ICOs and defining utility tokens and securities. And I'll get into that a little later. So this is kind of the third kind of triad of bills that we've passed this year to really enable that industry in our market so that companies that are participating in this space can grow and scale. Dash is based out of Arizona. They're headquartered there. Sweetbridge is based out of Arizona, innovating in supply chain. So we have a robust density of companies in this space that are present and participating in our innovation in our state. How do we continue to scale that and allow them to do that with regulatory certainty?
Speaking about regulatory certainty, what can we do to help law enforcement understand that Bitcoin and blockchain is not a threat to any services that they may provide?
Yeah, sure. So it's sad that still in this day and age, all of the news headlines, or a lot of news headlines, are that Bitcoin is the currency of criminals, or it's being used in this new criminal activity. So a lot of the work we do at the Alliance is to clear up those misconceptions and really talk to law enforcement agencies and the people who are on the ground running investigations, trying to trace criminal use of Bitcoin, walk them through how to do that. And so we have the industry come in, a lot of the like analytics or tracing, the companies who have the tracing tools will come and present on different types of cryptocurrencies, different techniques for tracing them through decentralized exchanges, through an exchange, that kind of activity. And I think that's clearing up that misconception is really important for definitely for the law enforcement and government agencies, but also just for the public in general, so that it doesn't hinder the adoption of blockchain and cryptocurrency technology.
So one of the major barriers I could foresee is custody. Should the federal government move into blockchain, there's going to be a need to have custody of their digital assets. Can you talk to me, Adam, about what you might envision, what that might look like for the federal government?
Sure, and I think there's actually a couple ways of answering that, or maybe talking about it a little bit. Some of what Chelsea touched on. There's what has been largely, I would say, the headline is the crypto crime wave, and I think that doesn't help the law enforcement angle to this. It doesn't help the Bitcoin is the currency of criminals narrative, but it's very much here and it's very real, and it's not because they're being used in some cases. Certainly there are edge cases. It's being used for illicit activity. It's being used more as a untraceable mechanism or an asset that's untraceable in some cases to be stolen. So just the other day, I live in Manhattan. Just the other day, there was an individual who was at the Ruby Tuesdays in Times Square. Don't know why you'd go to either the Ruby Tuesdays or Times Square, but he was talking with a friend of his at a bar. This made the Wall Street Journal. He was talking about $1.5 million in Ether that he had on a ledger in his apartment. He came out of that after a few cocktails and was held at gunpoint, forced into a van, driven to his apartment, and his Ether is now no longer his. So I think there's that problem that needs to be solved from a where custody or where crypto is stored and how diligent individuals are, whether they're the average run-of-the-mill retail individual who is a hobbyist at best to more sophisticated institutions, and then getting more towards the macro around government. What happens when the SEC seizes $100 billion in crypto or $1 billion in crypto or whatever the case may be? Where do they store that, and how is that held? And I think that is a problem that Wall Street, hedge funds, et cetera, have been looking for solutions. They've started to emerge, us being one of them over the last 6 months or so, to provide that kind of objective third-party notion of a custodian that can handle your assets for you without exposing you or your personnel to any type of undue risk. The government's also going to be needing something along those lines as enforcement actions ramp up, as the government may actually at some point hold a position in some of these markets. So yeah, I think they're going to need many of the same solutions that Wall Street's currently demanding. There are some players in it, but I think a lot of it gets back to it is a nascent industry, and lacking any type of regulatory guidance, it's kind of the Wild West at the moment. Everyone's trying to do the best they can without clear and concise guidance.
So I think for everyone here, custody is definitely an issue for us. Education of our elected officials and law enforcement is also going to be very important in this regulatory sandbox. And that approach is something that we probably all think is just great ideas. I think that one of the things that ultimately we're going to be called upon to do is how do we educate a nation, not just the government, but the nation about crypto and what type of things that the government do to, or the populace do to educate the government about what this could actually mean for our democracy, I guess, in terms of the use of crypto in voting, not crypto, but blockchain for voting and the like. Do you guys have any questions, comments on that?
I guess I might add that I think a lot of times consumers drive innovation, and particularly in the blockchain industry, it really is consumers driving the need for transparency. Like if you want a transparent food supply chain so you know where your food came from, it's the consumers who are going to drive that innovation to happen and end up, paying for some of that to happen. But the government's not just going to implement a blockchain solution because blockchain's cool and they want to. There really needs to be something driving that motivating force.
I would just add that you're here because you're interested in blockchain, you're interested in crypto, whatever your angle is. You should be vocal. Like, you're on the leading edge, even though a lot of people, if you go buy your first Bitcoin today, there are certainly people in this room that would say you're late to the game. depends. If you're playing the long game in the next 50 years, you're probably still pretty early. I would say it's on a lot of you, it's a lot of us, a lot of everyone here to evangelize and to educate. I'm a big advocate for getting involved at all levels, to include your representatives just a few miles down the street in DC, here to work with them, to offer to educate, to engage in some way with your elected representatives, because I think that's the only mechanism that it's one of the few mechanisms that exist to actually drive the education component, to drive the changes that will certainly happen from a macro level, whether that's elections, whether that's food supply chain, regardless of what it is. It's going to require people in this city to actually understand what's going on and vote accordingly.
I think there's an interesting movement from what we've been doing in Arizona. We have the Desert Blockchain Alliance, which has the enterprise companies that are in the blockchain space, startups, companies that are banks in Arizona that are piloting blockchain technologies. And we have our reps come to those meetings on the last Wednesday of every month, and they're getting updates on what the emerging trends are, what the new protocols are, the companies are innovating in a space, how they can support it. Sometimes you ask very tough questions. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. Is blockchain Bitcoin? And that's always the first question we have to answer. They're not synonymous. And I think from the Desert Blockchain Alliance, we've had other stakeholders participate in education of our legislators. And we also have Representative Swikert here at the Capitol, who's been a really huge evangelist for blockchain, and he has a blockchain council that he runs, and he educates his caucus basically on blockchain. And so he relies on the industry. I've met with his staff several times to talk about how can we continue to educate the congressional caucus on blockchain and what it means. I think one area to look at to convince government is the unbanked population. So the unbanked population in the U.S., 60% of the U.S. is unbanked. So you think about immigrants, you think about the poverty rate, you think about poor people that don't have access to financial tools and banking technology. How do you serve that population? Well, blockchain is one of the prime ways to serve the unbanked population. So you think about welfare benefits and the cost to government on providing welfare benefits to the unbanked population. I think last I heard was $5 or $6 per benefit. You do the math on welfare transactions, how much government can save through blockchain. So there is an interest in that aspect of what's going on in terms of the public benefit, public use of blockchain to make government more efficient and to serve the underserved populations in the U.S. That I think is meaningful to, if you're on a conservative side, you want to cut spending, right? And if you are on the liberal side, you want to serve the unbanked population and expand access and equity. So it's really kind of nonpartisan and something addressing the unbanked population. So that's really a locus of focus that I would recommend.
So briefly, what's the one thing that you're looking forward to in the evolution of blockchain over the next year that you think that could, and how does that intersect with government and blockchain? So is there something that's coming forward that you can see that you really think that could either aid adoption by the government, or that will really aid the cause, I guess, adoption and use by the government, I guess?
That's a good question. I think more conferences, more discussion, more education, to Chelsea's point, is going to help. I think there isn't going to be a time where anyone within government feels comfortable moving forward on something unless they feel it's the right decision. And that's not going to happen unless they're well educated on it. And I think for years, we've been hearing about skill gaps within government. Cybersecurity has been something very common that you hear about in the last 10 years or so. I think there's going to have to be a very serious investment in upgrading skills at a lot of agencies in order to drive these agencies to embrace that technology. And I'm optimistic that that's going to happen. Maybe not in the next year, probably in the next 24 to 36 months. We're going to see those things start to come to fruition. But who knows what will actually happen.
So I might twist the question a little bit of what I'm hoping for in the next year in the blockchain industry, and that is for the industry as a whole to be more diverse, both in terms of gender, race, socioeconomic background, just who is participating in these discussions. I think language and communicating internationally is extremely important. To Darren's point of helping the unbanked, the ideological aspect of blockchain is that can help all these people who don't have access to existing systems. And if we can really think more from a more diverse perspective of how to solve those problems and reach those people, that's really important. And also communicating internationally to talk about failures and successes over the next year so we can learn from people who are implementing it and hopefully improve what's going on.
This is something that Adam mentioned when we were prepping for the panel, is regulatory clarity, regulatory certainty, and I think that really directly affects his industry. And I think it affects my job of getting companies to scale up in our market in the U.S. in general and getting them here, a soft landing in the market. I think Adam mentioned that there's an estimate of there's $10 billion in capital on the sidelines, and he thinks it's closer to $100 billion. So that regulatory certainty could seriously liquidate a lot of that, provide liquidity for a lot of that capital on the sidelines. So there's a huge economic benefit for that, and then it's also allows some of the companies that are piloting and are testing different blockchain deployments to really go to scale and go to market, and that's what I really hope to see.
And I would just add one piece, so that way I'm not misquoted. Who knows what the actual amount of money on the sidelines is? I look at it as you could pick 5 of the top hedge funds, and if they were to put 50 basis points of their portfolio into crypto, they would all of a sudden become the 5 biggest crypto holders in the world. So there's just so much money that exists in traditional assets, and it's sitting on the sidelines waiting for that regulatory clarity. So is it 100 billion? Who knows? It certainly could be. But yeah, just want to make sure that I'm clear. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't have any math to back up the 100 billion number. It's a nice round number.
So I think that we are nearing the end of our time. I'd like to thank you guys for taking the time out with us today. We'd like to open up the floor. Sure. We would like to open the floor for any questions that we may have. So, yes, sir.
I have a question for Darren.
Sure.
Is the state actually implementing? I don't know you setting up an environment where blockchain might flower, but rather putting into practice, in effect, an actual blockchain-based program of any sort for delivery of citizen services or something else to benefit the citizens directly through government service.
So I'll restate the question for everyone, for everyone's benefit. The question is whether the state is actually implementing blockchain in a way to deliver services to citizens, or is it just the regulatory sandbox, the ecosystem rather?
Great question, and I can't go into detail what we're doing. There are 2 pilots we're looking at with the state. One is one that came out of a conversation at this very conference last year that led to a pilot that we're looking at, the first of its kind in the U.S. on the identity space. And so both pilots are in identity space, and what they're hoping to do is address the unbanked population in Arizona. We have a large immigrant population in Arizona that's currently unbanked, and so how do you provision services and verify identity of that unbanked population as they transact and engage in government services. The second pilot, also on the identity space, is on our licensing, so your driver's license. So using a blockchain for that. That's all I can say about that. But I know that our CIO of the state wants to launch this pilot, and it's in talks with a couple of enterprise companies that want to support that.
So the question I have is that the sandbox we're talking about, the transactions that occur, those are all fictitious.
No, they're real.
So I'll restate the question for the benefit of the audience. The question is whether in the sandbox the transactions are fictitious, or do these sandbox participants interact with real citizens of Arizona?
They interact with real citizens. So there's a cap. You have 10,000 customers in Arizona is the cap. So if you're a consumer lender or money transmitter, you can service 10,000 customers in Arizona. You can get an exemption up to 17,000 if you meet certain requirements. The Attorney General's office regulates that. So these are real transactions. They have to meet certain requirements in terms of fiduciary responsibility to investors or to the customers. And like I said, our Attorney General's office ensures that they are compliant with some of those minimal requirements on making sure that you're not frauding your customers.
Okay, sir, I believe you were next.
So everybody talks about regulatory clarity. I was wondering if each of you could talk about one specific thing that's at the top of your list that's been most beneficial from a regulatory clarity perspective. Blockchain, crypto,
Sure. If there's anyone from the SEC or FINRA here, I apologize. It would be registered investment advisors. Firms along those lines have, they have to be registered with the SEC. There's certain guidelines and requirements that they have. There has been very little clarity coming out officially around how do you handle custody for crypto assets. Obviously, I'm biased, and it's something I think about a lot, but I think a very strong position with licenses issued by federal regulators would be the clarity that a lot of the institutional side of this puzzle is waiting on. The retail side is kind of going, and there's this patchwork of money transmitter laws and other things that may work. Like we'll see if there is an attorney somewhere who doesn't think that is the case. I think it's too early to actually have that fleshed out. But from my view, it's the federal licensing component that needs to be figured out and figured out quickly, because to my earlier point around kind of the crypto crime wave that's happening, it's not just there is a lot of capital on the sidelines that would be great to be injected into this particular industry, to this alternative asset class, but it's also creating a public safety issue. You have, hedge funds, for example, that have, 50 million on a USB drive in their office safe. They're asking for some type of active shooter situation or some type of other really bad case scenario, and I don't think anyone is really thinking it through from a public safety perspective either.
So I think in terms of money transmitters and state licensing, there needs to be some clarity for cryptocurrency exchanges. If they want to operate in all 50 states, they currently have to go to each and every state and figure out those state regulations surrounding exchanging cryptocurrency to fiat and cryptocurrency to cryptocurrency. And it's a huge burden to the industry, both in terms of costs and time, in terms of figuring out those regulations and which licenses they need to get. And I don't necessarily have a solution to that, but working through that, I think, is important.
That's a really good point. We've had a few companies that have come to us about setting up exchanges in Arizona, and our Attorney General says, if you meet these requirements, they have laid out the requirements, you can operate in Arizona, but eventually you have to meet the Fed's requirement for setting up an exchange, and then they all just go, oh, wow, that's a few $1 million of compliance costs, no thanks. So to your point, that would be a huge reduction of the barriers to entry there. The other piece is it ICOs, are they securities or not? So every time you hear something, it's like it's security, but it's not. There's no legs behind it. You can make a public statement saying it is security, but there's no legs to prosecute that or to enforce that. So that level of certainty is really important, because now we have a patchwork of states that are looking at ICO and crowdfunding legislation. That's really unclear. So we have our crowdfunding legislation for ICOs. Wyoming has their crowdfunding legislation. There's a couple of other bills in the pipeline for that. It just creates a lot of uncertainty, and because you have this patchwork of different legislation, and having that clarity from the federal side, I think, will be very important.
And one other thing, as Darren was saying, made me think of this is, he mentioned millions of dollars to get these licenses, and I understand we have to protect Main Street, we have to protect Wall Street. There are these there's checks and balances for a reason, but what we're effectively doing is we're causing centralization to occur, to where only the currently entrenched financial services organizations, the current companies that we all know, the current VCs that back all of the companies that we all use every day, it's only those companies that are actually willing to take the risk and invest the capital. So we're kind of defeating, and we can feel free to chat with me afterwards if you want to hear me talk about centralization versus not in this industry, but we're actually creating a centralized environment that was kind of the antithesis of what the purists at the very original, the ones that started this whole crypto blockchain movement had envisioned, I think, in my opinion.
Okay. One more thing I want to mention too, to your question, is don't overregulate. So that's something that when we talk to attorneys, it's like enact enabling legislation, but don't try to do too much, because this industry is constantly evolving. So kind of the other aspect of this question is let's not do too much, just let it grow and get government out of the way.
Okay, so we'd like to thank everyone for our time here today. We enjoyed sharing our opinions with you. So my take would be taxation. We need clarity around taxation. That's not as idiotic as it stands today. We need, I think that's a lot of opinion, right? I'm here to talk to, and we are happy to continue the conversation.
Also, let's give a big round of applause to Joel for stepping up here.